She looks just like my daughter. Annie flinched. The cardboard gift box wobbled in her hands. She stepped back instinctively, her sneakers scraping the floor, her fingers tightening around the edges as if the box were the only thing anchoring her in place. For a brief second, she looked around, unsure whether the words had truly been meant for her or if she had misunderstood. "Me?" she stammered. "Sir, are you talking to me?" Daniel Wright realized too late how close he had moved. He stopped, forcing himself to step back, to lower his shoulders, to soften his posture the way he had learned to do in boardrooms when deals were about to collapse. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Annie nodded, though her eyes remained wary. Adults always said that. "Sorry. Didn't mean to." She had learned those words didn't always change what came next. You can take the gift," she said, lifting the box slightly, returning to the routine that made sense. "Everyone gets one. That one is yours," Daniel replied. She hesitated, then accepted it again, polite and careful. "Thank you, sir. You don't have to call me that," he said. She frowned, thinking, "What should I call you?" The question struck him harder than any accusation ever had. A dozen answers rushed to his mind, none of them allowed. None of them safe. "Daniel," he said at last. "Okay, Daniel." The way she said his name slowly, deliberately made his chest tighten. As she shifted her weight, the collar of her sweater slipped just enough for him to notice the thin gold chain around her neck. "That necklace," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's important to you, isn't it?" Annie's hand flew up at once, covering it. "My mommy gave it to me," she said. "She said I should never take it off." Beast. Daniel felt a sudden pressure behind his eyes. "What was her name?" he asked. "Grace," Annie answered after a pause. "Grace Williams." The name landed like a blow. Daniel inhaled sharply, then noticed something else, something he hadn't seen before. As Annie's hand lowered slightly, he saw it clearly now. The crescent-shaped birthmark. It sat softly against her cheek, faint but unmistakable. The exact same place he had kissed 6 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and rain. His breath caught. "Annie," he said slowly. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "You can ask." "That mark on your cheek," he said, gesturing gently. "Has it always been there?" She touched it with her fingertips, self-conscious. "Yes. The ladies here say it looks like the moon." Daniel swallowed hard. "My daughter," he said, almost to himself, "has the same mark. Exactly the same." Annie looked at him, confusion replacing caution. "Really?" "Yes," he whispered. "Exactly the same." Silence stretched between them, fragile and trembling. "Annie," Daniel said, lowering himself so they were eye level. "How old are you?" "6, she replied. "I'll be 7 next spring." "And your birthday?" "March 15th. The world narrowed to a single, unbearable point. Daniel straightened slowly. "Annie," he said, his voice breaking despite himself. "I believe you are my daughter." Her eyes widened. She shook her head at once. "That's not possible. My daddy never came." "I know," Daniel said. "But I didn't know where you were. I never stopped looking." She clutched the gift box tighter. "If you're my daddy," she asked in a small voice, "why didn't you save me?" The question cut deeper than any courtroom verdict. "Because," Daniel said carefully, "I trusted people who lied to me, and because I didn't know how cruel silence could be." Annie looked at him for a long moment, then glanced down at the necklace again. "You said you gave this to your daughter." "I did," Daniel said. "The night she was born." Her breath hitched. "My mommy said my daddy loved me before he ever saw me." Daniel closed his eyes. "She told you the truth." Annie didn't cry. She simply stood there, small and overwhelmed, holding a truth too heavy for her age. "I need to speak with the adults here," Daniel said gently. "Will you wait for me?" She nodded slowly. "Okay." Daniel turned and walked toward the administrative office, his legs unsteady. A woman behind the desk looked up in surprise. "I need to see the file for a child named Annie Williams," he said. Now, the woman hesitated. Sir, that information is confidential. I understand, Daniel interrupted. But I believe she is my daughter. A tense moment passed before another staff member appeared. Older, measured. Please, she said. Come with me. Inside the small office, a thin folder was placed on the desk. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. Name, Annie Williams. Date of birth, March 15. Mother, Grace Williams. Father, unknown. Daniel exhaled shakily. Unknown, he repeated. The mother passed away shortly after giving birth. The woman said softly. The child was placed in our care soon after. Said. Daniel closed the folder, his vision blurring. Everything matched. Every detail. Every lie he had been told. That's my daughter, he said firmly. The woman studied his face, then nodded slowly. We'll need to proceed carefully, she said. But if what you're saying is true, it is, Daniel replied, and I will prove it. He stepped back into the room where Annie waited, still holding her gift, still guarding her necklace. Annie, he said, kneeling once more in front of her. We're going to take a test, just to be sure. And after that, I'm going to bring you home. She looked at him, searching his face for certainty. You promise? She asked. Daniel nodded. I promise. And this time, I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. Annie didn't smile. She simply stepped closer, just enough to let her shoulder brush his arm. For Daniel Wright, it was the first true beginning he had felt in 6 years. Daniel did not leave the care center right away. After he promised Annie that he would come back, after he spoke with the administrators and requested the formal process to begin, he found himself sitting alone in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, unable to turn the key. The city moved around him as it always had, cars passing, horns in the distance, life continuing without pause. But for the first time in 6 years, Daniel Wright felt as if time had finally slowed enough for him to breathe. Annie's face would not leave his mind. Not just the resemblance. Not just the birthmark or the necklace. It was the way she had asked him if he was going to leave. The question had not been dramatic. There had been no accusation in it. Only experience. A child who had learned, far too early, that adults were temporary. I'm not leaving, he said aloud now, alone in the car, as if saying it again might make it more real. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. For once, the world could wait. 6 years. 6 years of searching without knowing what he was truly searching for. He had hired investigators, made quiet inquiries, reviewed hospital records late into the night. Every lead had dissolved into nothing. Every dead end had been followed by another lie he hadn't recognized as a lie at the time. She was ashamed, his mother had said. The memory curdled in his chest now. He saw it clearly. The careful sadness on her face. The way the family had closed ranks around him, offering comfort while guiding him away from the truth. They had not raised their voices. They had not threatened him. They had simply decided for him. Daniel leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself to replay the night Grace had disappeared, not as confusion, but as evidence. The unanswered calls, the vague explanations, the speed with which the narrative had been presented to him, complete and convenient. He had been grieving, exhausted, desperate to believe that the woman he loved had made a choice, not that it had been stolen from her. I failed you, he whispered, thinking of Annie. And I failed her. I warned. If this story touched something real inside you, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next one. Inside the care center, Annie sat on the edge of her bed with the gift box resting unopened in her lap. She hadn't meant to carry it all the way back to her room, but no one had stopped her. The adults were busy. They were always busy when something important happened. She stared at the box without touching it. Her heart was still beating too fast. The man's voice, Daniel's voice, echoed in her head. I believe you are my daughter. The words didn't make sense yet. They felt too big, like shoes that didn't fit. She touched the necklace again, the familiar coolness of the chain grounding her. Her mother's voice lived there, in that small gesture. Never take it off, no matter what. If he was telling the truth, then her mommy had been telling the truth too. That her daddy had loved her. That he hadn't left because he didn't care. Annie's throat tightened. She swallowed hard, the way she had learned to do when crying wasn't allowed. What if he's wrong? She whispered to herself. What if he wasn't? That thought scared her more. Back in his apartment that night, Daniel stood in the doorway of a room that had never been used. It was technically a guest room. Untouched. Impersonal. He had walked past it countless times without seeing it. Tonight, it felt like an accusation. He moved through the apartment restlessly, opening drawers, pulling out old documents, birth records, travel itineraries, photos he had avoided for years. Grace's smile looked back at him from the past, warm. Knowing, already aware of truths he had been too protected to imagine. I should have fought harder, he said to the empty room. At 2 in the morning, he called his attorney. I need a DNA test arranged immediately, Daniel said without preamble. And I need you to prepare for a custody petition. There was a pause on the other end. Daniel, the attorney said carefully, this kind of case. I know exactly what kind of case it is, Daniel interrupted. And I'm not negotiating. Silence followed, then a measured sigh. All right, I'll start the process. When the call ended, Daniel sat down heavily on the couch and let his head fall into his hands. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine Annie in his life not as a possibility, but as a responsibility. Breakfasts, school mornings, fear, joy, questions he wouldn't always know how to answer. He welcomed all of it. The next morning, Daniel returned to the care center without cameras, without assistance. Annie was in the common room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing. She looked up when she saw him, surprise flickering across her face. You came back, she said. I told you I would, Daniel replied. She nodded slowly, as if marking a point in her memory. Adults said many things. This one had returned. They sat at a small table together. She showed him her drawing a house with uneven windows and a tree that leaned slightly to one side. It's not finished, she said quickly. I don't know what the inside looks like yet. Daniel looked at the paper. You'll figure it out, he said. Some things take time. She studied him, then asked, Are you really going to take the test? Yes, he said. So we can be sure. And so no one can take this away from us. She thought about that. Okay, she said. I want to be sure too. That afternoon, Daniel spoke again with the center's management. He asked questions, careful ones about Annie's life, her habits, her health, her school performance. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing every detail as if each one were proof that she was real. She doesn't ask for much, one of the staff members said. She's very self-sufficient for her age. Daniel felt a familiar ache settle in his chest. No 6-year-old should have to be. When he left that evening, Annie walked him to the door. You'll come tomorrow? She asked. Yes. And the day after? Yes. She nodded, satisfied. Okay. Creases. Daniel watched her disappear back into the building before turning away. This time, when he reached his car, he did not hesitate. The search was over. The fight was just beginning. The DNA lab was quiet in the way serious places always were. No music, no chatter, just the soft hum of machines and the muted footsteps of people who understood that what happened here could change lives. Daniel noticed those details without really processing them. His attention was fixed on Annie, who sat on the edge of the chair with her feet not quite touching the floor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. You're doing great, he said, keeping his voice calm. Annie nodded, though her eyes were locked on the technician preparing the swab. It doesn't hurt, right? Not at all, the woman said kindly. Just a quick tickle. Annie glanced at Daniel. You'll stay? I'm right here, he said, and meant more than the words themselves. The test was over in minutes. Annie barely reacted, more curious than afraid. Daniel, on the other hand, felt as if every second stretched longer than the last once it was done. The technician explained the process, the waiting period, the paperwork. Daniel listened, asked questions, signed forms. He did not mention money. For once, it felt irrelevant. When they stepped back outside, Annie squinted at the daylight. "So now we wait?" "Yes," Daniel said. "That's the hardest part." She considered this. "I'm good at waiting," she said matter-of-factly. "I've been waiting a long time." The statement landed quietly between them, heavy with meaning. Daniel crouched down to her level. "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry." Annie studied his face, as if weighing something. "You don't look like someone who runs away," she said. "I did," Daniel replied honestly. "I just didn't know it at the time." That afternoon, Daniel took her back to the care center and stayed longer than usual. He helped her with homework she hadn't finished, listened as she read aloud, her voice careful and deliberate. She struggled with a few words, frowned at herself when she made a mistake. "It's okay," Daniel said. "Everyone learns at a different pace. My mommy used to say that," Annie murmured. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second. "She sounds like she was very wise." "She was," Annie said. Then, after a pause, "Do you miss her?" Every answer Daniel rehearsed in his mind felt insufficient. "Every day," he said at last. "And I think she would be very proud of you." "To Will." Annie didn't respond right away. She traced the edge of the paper with her pencil, then nodded once, small and resolute. That evening, Daniel's phone finally became impossible to ignore. His mother's name flashed across the screen. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Yes? I heard you visited a care center today," she said. Her tone was light, almost pleasant. "Someone mentioned it." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I found my daughter." Silence. "That's not funny," she said. "I'm not joking." Another pause, longer this time. "Daniel, you're under a great deal of stress. Grief can make people see connections that aren't there. She has Grace's name. She has my face. She has the birthmark. And she has the necklace I gave her," Daniel said, each word deliberate. "I'm having a DNA test done." The air on the other end of the line felt colder somehow. "This will complicate things unnecessarily," his mother said. "You've built a life." "No," Daniel interrupted quietly. "I built a company. This is my life." Her voice hardened. "You're making a mistake." Daniel looked out the window, imagining Annie's careful smile, the way she held her gift box as if it might disappear. "I already did," he said. "I'm done making them." He ended the call before she could respond. At the care center, Annie lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't afraid. Exactly. But her thoughts kept circling the same questions. What if the test said no? What if Daniel stopped coming? What if hope hurt more than not hoping at all? She touched the necklace again and whispered her mother's name into the darkness. "Please," she said softly. "If he's really my daddy, help him stay." The days that followed settled into a fragile routine. Daniel came every afternoon. Sometimes he brought books. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. Annie started to expect him, then to trust that expectation. She showed him her favorite spot in the courtyard, her least favorite food in the cafeteria, the teacher who made her feel smartest. Daniel listened. He learned. He adjusted his schedule without announcing it to anyone. Meetings were rescheduled. Calls were returned later. For the first time in years, he felt present. One afternoon, Annie asked, "If I come home with you, will I still see my friends here?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "And if you want, they can visit too." She nodded, relieved. "Okay." The call from the lab came on a Thursday morning. Daniel was in his office, staring at a contract he hadn't read for 10 minutes straight. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mr. Wright," the voice said. "Your results are ready." He stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. "Send them," he said, "and email my attorney." When the email arrived, Daniel didn't open it right away. He sat still, breathing slowly, preparing himself for either outcome. When he finally looked, the words were unmistakable. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Daniel closed his eyes. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was grief, sharp and immediate. Grief for 6 lost years, grief for Grace, grief for a little girl who had learned to wait. That afternoon, he went to the care center earlier than usual. Annie looked up from her drawing when he entered. "You're early," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied, kneeling in front of her. "I got the results." Her pencil paused midair. "And?" Daniel took a breath. "They say I'm your father." Annie stared at him. Then, slowly, her face crumpled not into sobs, but into something like relief finally letting go. "For real?" she whispered. "For real," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." "I do." She leaned forward then, resting her forehead against his shoulder. Daniel wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if afraid the moment might break. For the first time, Annie didn't pull away. For Daniel Wright, the truth had arrived at last. Now he would have to fight to keep it. The news traveled faster than Daniel expected. By the time he arrived at his office the morning after the DNA results, 3 calls were already waiting on his phone. His assistant had left a message asking if he wanted to reschedule a board meeting. His lawyer had sent a brief text, "We need to talk today." And his mother had called twice without leaving a voicemail. Daniel stood by the window of his office, looking down at the city he had helped shape with steel and glass. For years, this view had made him feel powerful. That morning, it felt small. He turned away and picked up the phone. "Clear my schedule," he told his assistant. "Everything except legal." There was a pause on the other end. "All day? All day," Daniel repeated. When his lawyer arrived, he brought a thick folder and a cautious expression. They sat across from each other, the polished table between them suddenly resembling a barrier rather than a convenience. "I assume you've seen the results," the lawyer began. "I have," Daniel said. "And I want custody," the lawyer nodded slowly. "That will not be simple. I didn't expect it to be. The child has been in state care for several years. There are procedures, evaluations, temporary arrangements, before anything permanent." Daniel leaned forward. "Tell me what needs to be done, Einstein." As the lawyer outlined the process, home assessments, psychological evaluations, court hearings, Daniel listened intently. None of it deterred him. If anything, the structure steadied him. There was a path forward, a way to make this real. "There's something else," the lawyer added carefully. "Your family." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What about them? They may contest this. Not legally, perhaps, but socially, publicly. This could attract attention." Daniel exhaled slowly, then let it. The lawyer studied him for a moment. "You're serious." "I've never been more serious in my life." That afternoon, Daniel went to the care center with the results printed and folded neatly in his jacket pocket. Annie was in the courtyard, sitting on a low bench, swinging her legs absently. When she saw him, she jumped up. "You came," she said, smiling before she could stop herself. "I always will," Daniel replied. They sat together, side by side. Daniel didn't rush. He let the silence settle, let the ordinary sounds of children playing fill the space. Then he took out the paper. "These are the results," he said. "They confirm what we talked about yesterday." Annie looked at the paper but didn't reach for it. "So, it's real," she said. "Yes," she nodded, processing. "Does that mean I can come home now?" Daniel hesitated, choosing his words with care. "It means we're closer, but there are steps. People who have to make sure everything is safe and right." Her shoulders slumped slightly. "More waiting." "I know," he said. "But I'll be here the whole time." She looked up at him. "You promise?" "Yes," he said. "And this time, it's not just words. It's written down." That seemed to help. Annie smiled faintly and leaned back against the bench. Later that evening, Daniel's mother finally confronted him in person. She arrived unannounced at his apartment, as she always had when she disapproved of something. "She's a child from a care center," she said, standing rigidly in the living room. "You don't know what kind of complications." "She's my daughter," Daniel interrupted. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "You don't understand what this will do to the family," she said. Daniel met her gaze steadily. "I understand exactly what the family did." Her expression flickered. We protected you. You protected yourselves, Daniel replied. And you destroyed 6 years of my life in the process. Silence followed. Then his mother straightened. If you go through with this, don't expect our support. Daniel nodded once. I didn't come here asking for it. When she left, the apartment felt quieter than usual. Daniel stood alone for a long moment, then walked into the unused room again. This time, he didn't stop at the doorway. He stepped inside and looked around, imagining shelves filled with books, drawings taped to the walls, a small bed where someone would finally sleep without fear of being moved again. At the care center, Annie lay awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling for the night. She thought about Daniel's face when he said he was her father, about the way he didn't look away, about the way he stayed. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine something different, a room that was hers, a door that didn't open without warning, a man who came back every time he said he would. She hugged the gift box to her chest and closed her eyes. Somewhere across the city, Daniel did the same thing, imagining a future that no longer felt impossible, only difficult. And for the first time, difficult felt manageable, because this time, he wasn't alone. The social worker arrived the following Monday. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and she carried a clipboard tucked neatly against her chest, the way people do when they want to appear neutral. She was in her late 40s, practical shoes, calm eyes, the kind of professional who had learned to read a room without letting the room read her back. Daniel greeted her at the door of his apartment with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming," he said. "That's my job," Karen replied, offering a polite smile. "This won't take too long if everything is straightforward." Daniel nodded and stepped aside to let her in. As Karen moved through the apartment, she asked questions in an even tone, about Daniel's work schedule, about his support system, about why he wanted custody now, after so many years. Daniel answered without embellishment. He didn't perform. He didn't minimize his absence or dramatize his discovery. He told the truth, plainly and fully, even when it made him look foolish or naive. "I trusted people who shouldn't have been trusted," he said at one point, "and a child paid the price for that. I won't let it happen again." Karen paused her notes briefly and looked up at him. "Children don't need perfect parents," she said. "They need consistent ones. That's what I intend to be." When she left, Daniel sat down heavily on the couch. The apartment felt too large, too quiet. For the first time, he noticed how everything in his life had been arranged for one plate, one coffee mug, one toothbrush. He stood and walked into the spare room again. This time, he opened the closet. At the care center, Annie was having a harder day. It started small. A disagreement over crayons. A teacher's raised voice when Annie didn't respond quickly enough. By lunchtime, her stomach hurt, and she didn't feel like eating. She sat alone, pushing peas around her plate, watching other children laugh too loudly, move too freely. She wondered what Daniel was doing. If he was thinking about her, if he might forget. "You're quiet today," one of the caregivers said gently. "I'm okay," Annie replied automatically. That afternoon, when Daniel arrived, Annie didn't run to him. She stayed where she was, arms folded, her expression careful again. Daniel noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She shrugged. "Nothing." He crouched down in front of her. "Something happened." She hesitated, then looked away. "What if the lady says no?" she asked. "The social worker?" She nodded. "What if they say I can't go with you?" Daniel took a slow breath. "Then we keep trying." She studied his face. "You won't get tired?" "No," he said. "I waited 6 years to find you. I can wait longer if I have to." That seemed to ease something inside her. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forehead against his shoulder. Just for a moment. Daniel didn't move. He simply stayed where he was, letting her decide how close was safe. That night, Daniel made a decision. He called a realtor and asked for houses, not penthouses, not gated estates. He wanted something quieter, something with a yard, something that felt like a beginning instead of a display. "I don't need the biggest," he said. "I need the right one." It said. The following days were a blur of appointments and paperwork. The custody petition was filed. The DNA results were formally submitted. Karen requested follow-up interviews. Everything moved slower than Daniel wanted, and faster than Annie dared to hope. One evening, Annie asked, "If I live with you, will I still go to school?" "Yes," Daniel said, smiling slightly. "A very good one. And I can keep my necklace?" "Always." She nodded, satisfied. At the end of the week, Daniel received another call from his mother. "I won't pretend I agree with you," she said, her voice controlled. "But the board is concerned." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "This isn't a board decision." "You're wrong," she replied. "Everything you do reflects on the family." "For once," Daniel said quietly, "that's not my priority." Silence stretched between them. "If you proceed," she said at last, "you do so without us. We can't do so." Daniel looked at the city lights through his window. "Then I proceed alone." After the call ended, Daniel felt an unexpected calm settle over him. For years, the weight of expectation had been so constant he hadn't noticed its shape. Now that it was lifting, even slightly, he felt lighter. At the care center, Annie packed her few belongings into a small duffel bag she'd been given for temporary visits just in case. Clothes folded carefully. Her toothbrush, her drawings, the necklace never left her neck. She didn't tell anyone she was packing. She didn't want to jinx it. That night, she dreamed of a house with a door that only opened when someone knocked. The following Monday, Karen returned. She sat with Annie first, speaking to her at eye level, asking simple questions. "How do you feel about Daniel?" Karen asked. Annie thought for a moment. "He stays." Karen smiled gently. "That's important." Then Karen spoke with Daniel again. When she finally closed her notebook, she looked at him with something like approval. "I'll be recommending temporary custody," she said, "with conditions." Daniel's breath caught. "Thank you. This is just the first step," she reminded him. "I know," he said, "but it's the right one." When Daniel told Annie later that afternoon, she didn't cheer, she didn't cry. She simply reached for his hand and held it. For her, that was celebration enough. The judge's chambers were smaller than Daniel expected. There were no flags on the walls, no dramatic symbols of authority. Just a desk worn smooth by years of use, 2 chairs placed side by side, and a window that let in the pale light of a gray morning. The simplicity unsettled him more than a courtroom ever could. This room was not designed for speeches. It was designed for decisions. Annie sat next to him, her feet dangling slightly above the floor, her hand wrapped tightly around his. She wore the blue sweater he had brought her the week before, the one she had chosen herself because it felt warm but not itchy. The necklace rested against the fabric, exactly where it always was. "You okay?" Daniel whispered. She nodded. "I think so." Across from them, Karen Mitchell reviewed her notes one last time. "Remember," she said gently, "this isn't a test. Just answer honestly." Annie nodded again, solemn. When the judge entered, everyone stood. He was a man in his early 50s, calm-faced, with eyes that suggested he had heard every story twice already. He took his seat and gestured for them to do the same. "Good morning," he said. "We're here to discuss a request for temporary custody." He looked first at Annie. "And you must be Annie." She straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir. You don't have to call me that," the judge said kindly. "You can call me Judge." "Okay," Annie replied. The judge smiled faintly and turned to Daniel. "Mr. Wright, this situation is unusual." Daniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. You've only recently discovered that this child may be your daughter." "She is my daughter," Daniel said, not aggressively, just clearly. The judge raised an eyebrow. "The DNA confirms biological paternity," he acknowledged. "But biology alone isn't enough. What matters here is stability." Daniel swallowed. "I understand." The judge turned back to Annie. "Annie, do you know why you're here today?" She thought for a moment. "Because people want to know if I can stay with Daniel." "And do you want to?" the judge asked. She looked down at her hands, then back up. "Yes," she said. "He comes back." The judge paused. "He comes back?" "Yes," Annie said simply. "When he says he will." Something shifted in the room. The judge nodded slowly. "That's important." The questions continued. measured and calm. About Daniel's home, his work, his plans for childcare and school. About Annie's feelings, her routines, her fears. No one rushed her. No one interrupted. At one point, the judge asked, "Annie, what do you like most about Daniel?" She considered carefully. "He listens," she said. "Even when I'm quiet." Daniel felt his throat tighten. After a long moment, the judge leaned back in his chair. "I'm granting temporary custody," he said, "with supervision and regular check-ins. This is not permanent. It's a beginning. We will do." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. Annie didn't cheer. She simply squeezed his hand harder. Outside the building, the air felt sharper, cleaner. Daniel knelt in front of Annie on the steps. "You did great," he said. She nodded. "Does this mean I'm coming with you now?" "Yes," he replied. "If you're ready." She hesitated for only a second. Then she nodded again. "I'm ready." They returned to the care center together. Annie walked through the halls one last time, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Some of the children waved. A few hugged her awkwardly. One of the caregivers knelt and adjusted her collar, smoothing it down with practiced care. "Be good," she said softly. Annie nodded. "I will." When they stepped outside, Daniel opened the car door for her and helped her into the seat, carefully buckling her in. He had practiced the motion the night before, alone in his garage, just to be sure he wouldn't fumble. As he pulled away from the curb, Annie pressed her forehead lightly against the window, watching the building disappear behind them. "Are you sad?" Daniel asked gently. "A little," she said, "but mostly I'm not scared." He smiled. "That's okay." The drive was quiet. Annie hummed softly under her breath, a tune Daniel didn't recognize. He didn't interrupt. When they arrived at the house, Annie stared up at it for a long moment. It wasn't large. It wasn't impressive. But it had a small yard, a porch, and a tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn. "This is where we live?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "If you want to." She nodded slowly. "I like it." Inside, Annie walked carefully from room to room, touching nothing at first. When she reached the small bedroom Daniel had prepared, she stopped. "This is mine?" she asked. "Yes." There was not explaining. She stepped inside and looked around the bed with a simple quilt, the bookshelf half filled, the desk by the window. She placed her duffel bag on the floor and sat down on the bed, testing it. "It's soft," she said. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching her. For the first time, the house felt alive. That night, they ate a simple dinner. Annie insisted on helping set the table. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if afraid the moment might disappear if she rushed it. Afterward, Daniel showed her how to brush her teeth in the upstairs bathroom. She watched him closely, mimicking his movements. "You're doing it right," he said. She smiled faintly. At bedtime, she stood in the doorway of her room, suddenly uncertain. "You're not leaving, right?" Daniel knelt in front of her. "I'll be right across the hall," he said, "and I'll check on you." She nodded, then paused. "Will you tell me a story?" He hesitated. "I'm not very good at that." "Really wanna." "That's okay," she said. "You can try." So he did. He told her a simple story about a girl who traveled a long way to find a place where she belonged. His voice was rough at first, then steadier. Annie fell asleep before he finished. Daniel sat beside her bed for a long time after, watching her breathe, memorizing the curve of her face, the crescent mark on her cheek glowing faintly in the lamplight. 6 years too late, he thought, but he was here now, and this time, he would not let anyone decide for him again. The first morning felt unreal. Daniel woke before the alarm, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of responsibility pressing gently against his chest. For a few seconds, he lay still, listening. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than he was used to. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. He got up and walked down the hall, stopping in front of Annie's door. He hesitated, then knocked softly. "Annie?" he whispered. There was a pause, then a small voice. "Yes, I'm making breakfast," he said. "Pancakes, if that's okay." The door opened a crack. Annie peeked out, her hair sleep-tousled, the necklace already in place. "I like pancakes," she said. Relief washed through him, quiet and profound. In the kitchen, Daniel moved carefully, as if sudden motions might break something delicate. He had watched videos the night before, practiced flipping pancakes with unnecessary seriousness. The first one burned slightly. He set it aside without comment. Annie sat at the table, swinging her legs, watching him with solemn attention. "You don't have to be nervous," she said. Daniel glanced over. "I'm not nervous." She tilted her head. "You are, but that's okay. I get nervous too." He smiled. "Then we'll be nervous together." They ate slowly. Annie cut her pancake into precise squares. Daniel noticed the way she checked his face before speaking, as if confirming he was still there. "After breakfast," he said, "we're going to visit a school. Just to look." Her fork paused mid-air. "A new one?" "Yes. What if they don't like me?" Daniel met her eyes. "Then it's not the right school." That seemed to satisfy her. The drive was quiet. Annie watched the houses pass. The small details that made a neighborhood feel lived in. Bicycles on lawns, chalk drawings on sidewalks, a dog barking behind a fence. "This place feels normal," she said after a while. Daniel nodded. "That's what I hoped." The school was modest, brick-fronted, with a playground that showed signs of use rather than decoration. Inside, the principal greeted them warmly, speaking directly to Annie, not over her head. "We like students who ask questions," she said. Annie considered this. "I ask a lot. That's usually a good sign." Daniel watched the exchange, something easing inside him. Annie wasn't shrinking. She wasn't hiding. She was cautious, yes, but present. On the way home, Annie said, "I think I could like it there." "We'll take it one step at a time," Daniel replied. That afternoon, Annie explored the house more freely. She opened drawers, tested light switches, lined her drawings along the desk. Daniel stayed nearby but didn't hover, resisting the urge to narrate every reassurance. In the late afternoon, his phone rang. A reporter. Daniel let it go to voicemail. Then another call. And another. The story was moving faster than he'd hoped. A billionaire. A lost child. A care center. The pieces fit too neatly for public curiosity. That evening, after dinner, Annie grew quiet. She sat on the couch, hugging a pillow to her chest. "Do you have to go away again?" she asked suddenly. Daniel turned to her fully. "No, because people call you," she said. "And when people called my mommy, she got sad." Daniel chose his words carefully. "Some calls are about work. Some are about things I can say no to." She looked at him. "Will you say no for me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "As many times as it takes." She leaned against him then, light but deliberate. Daniel wrapped an arm around her. Still careful, still learning. That night, Annie woke from a nightmare. Daniel heard the sound immediately, a small cry, cut short, as if she were afraid to make noise. He was at her door in seconds. "It's okay," he said, kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here." "Oh." She clutched his sleeve. "Don't let them take me." "No one's taking you," he said firmly. "I won't let that happen." She breathed unevenly, then slowly settled. Daniel stayed until her breathing evened out again, until sleep reclaimed her. He didn't leave right away. Sitting there in the dim light, he thought about the years Annie had spent learning how not to need too much. The realization settled heavily, but it didn't paralyze him. It focused him. The next morning, he called his lawyer. "We need to be proactive," Daniel said. "Privacy protections, media boundaries. And your family?" the lawyer asked. Daniel looked down the hall toward Annie's room. "They don't get a vote." Later that day, Annie brought him a drawing. It showed a house with a tree out front. Two figures stood side by side. "Is this us?" Daniel asked. She nodded. "I didn't draw faces yet. I'm still figuring them out." He smiled. "Take your time. It impress." That evening, they cooked together. Annie insisted on stirring. She laughed when a bit of sauce splashed onto the counter. "Oops," she said. Daniel laughed too, surprised by how natural it felt. At bedtime, Annie paused in the doorway of her room. Will you check on me? Yes. Even if I don't call? Yes. She nodded and climbed into bed. Daniel tucked the blanket around her, then hesitated. Annie, he said softly, I know this is all new and scary. She looked up at him. But you're still here. Yes, he said. I am. She smiled, small and certain. As Daniel turned off the light, he understood something with quiet clarity. Being a father wasn't about grand gestures or fixing the past. It was about showing up tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day she needed him. The first week settled into a rhythm neither of them named, but both of them felt. Daniel woke early every morning, not because of alarms or meetings, but because his mind no longer allowed him to forget that someone else was depending on him. He learned to move quietly through the house, to listen for small sounds, a door opening, bare feet on the floor, the faint hum Annie made when she was thinking. Annie, for her part, watched everything. She noticed how Daniel checked the locks at night, how he laid out her clothes the evening before, how he paused before answering phone calls, as if deciding whether they deserved his attention. She did not comment on these things. She simply absorbed them, filing them away like evidence. Trust, she was learning, was built from patterns. On Thursday afternoon, Karen Mitchell returned for the first scheduled follow-up visit. Annie sat at the kitchen table with a glass of milk, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly. Do I have to answer everything? Annie asked quietly before Karen arrived. Daniel knelt beside her. Just tell the truth, he said. And if you don't want to answer something, you can say that. Annie nodded, reassured. Karen arrived on time, clipboard in hand as always. She greeted Annie first. Hello, Annie, she said. How are you doing today? Annie considered the question carefully. I'm okay, she said. Then, after a pause, I feel safe. Karen's pen paused for just a moment. They spoke together in the living room. Karen asked about Annie's sleep, her meals, her feelings. Annie answered simply, without embellishment. Does Daniel help you? Karen asked. Yes, Annie said. He listens. Karen smiled gently. That seems to matter to you. Annie nodded. A lot. ID. When Karen spoke privately with Daniel afterward, her tone remained professional, but there was something warmer beneath it. She's adjusting well, Karen said. But she's cautious. She has reason to be, Daniel replied. Karen nodded. So do you. That evening, after Karen left, Annie seemed quieter than usual. She picked at her dinner and barely touched her food. Did I say something wrong? She asked finally. Daniel set his fork down. No. Why would you think that? She was writing everything, Annie said. What if she writes something bad? Daniel leaned back in his chair, choosing his words with care. Karen's job isn't to find reasons to take you away. It's to make sure you're okay. Annie studied him. You're sure? Yes. She nodded slowly. Okay. Later that night, Annie sat on the floor of her room, surrounded by her drawings. She was sorting them, deciding which ones to keep and which ones to put away. Daniel watched from the doorway. Can I come in? He asked. She looked up. You already are. He smiled faintly and sat beside her. What are you doing? Organizing, she said, in case someone asks. About what? About me. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Daniel exhaled slowly. No one's going to ask you to prove anything. Annie shrugged. They always do. He reached out, then hesitated, then rested his hand lightly on the floor between them. You don't owe anyone an explanation for existing. She looked at him, puzzled. Really? Really? She absorbed that quietly, then handed him a drawing. This one is my mommy, she said. The drawing showed a woman with long hair and kind eyes, standing beneath a crescent moon. She told me stories, Annie said, about how the moon watches over people who are far away from each other. Daniel swallowed. She sounds wonderful. She was, Annie said. She said my daddy would come when the time was right. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I wish I had come sooner. Annie considered this. You came now. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was acceptance. And Daniel understood that acceptance was a gift he had not earned yet. The following Saturday, Daniel took Annie to the park. He chose a quiet one, tucked between rows of old trees, far from cameras and crowds. Annie walked beside him, her hand brushing his occasionally, not quite holding on. At the playground, she hesitated at the edge, watching other children run and climb. "You can go," Daniel said. "What if I fall? I'll catch you." She looked back at him. "You promise?" "Yes." She nodded once, then ran toward the swings. Daniel stood close, hands ready, heart racing with every small risk she took. When she stumbled, she laughed. When she climbed higher than she meant to, she called out to him, "Daniel, I'm here." He replied every time. On the drive home, Annie was unusually talkative. "Can we come back?" she asked. "Anytime. And maybe invite someone from school when I start?" "Yes. And maybe plant a tree in the yard?" Daniel smiled. "We can do that." That night, as Daniel tucked Annie into bed, she asked a question he knew would come eventually. "Are people mad at you because of me?" He paused. "Some people don't like change. Do you?" "I like this change," he said honestly. She nodded. "Me too." After she fell asleep, Daniel sat alone in the living room, phone in hand. Messages continued to pile up: business partners, family members, journalists. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he drafted a short statement for his lawyer. Private. Firm. Clear. His daughter's life was not a story for public consumption. This was not charity. This was not redemption. This was responsibility. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully, her necklace catching the soft glow of the nightlight. For the first time since she could remember, the house did not feel temporary. And for Daniel Wright, that quiet permanence was worth more than anything he had ever built. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded once, sealed neatly, and addressed in handwriting Daniel recognized instantly. He stood in the kitchen holding it for a long moment before opening it. Annie was at the table coloring, her feet tucked beneath the chair, her attention focused and serious. "Is it work?" she asked without looking up. "Yes," Daniel replied, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. He waited until she was absorbed again before unfolding the letter. It was from his mother. "Daniel, you have placed yourself and the family in an impossible position. This situation has already drawn attention we worked decades to avoid. I am asking you, one last time, to reconsider the path you are on. Temporary custody is not permanence. There is still time to resolve this quietly. For your sake, and for hers, Mother." Daniel read it twice, then folded it back into its envelope. There was no anger in him now, just a steady, unshakable certainty. He walked to the trash can and dropped the letter in. "Daniel?" Annie said suddenly. He turned. "Yes? You look like you're thinking very hard." He smiled faintly. "I am. Is it bad thinking or okay thinking?" He considered that. "It's the kind of thinking that helps me decide what's important." She nodded as if that made perfect sense and returned to her drawing. Later that day, Daniel received a call from his lawyer. "They're preparing a challenge," the lawyer said. "Not directly. They're questioning suitability, stability, media exposure." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "On what grounds?" "Mostly implication," the lawyer replied. "Nothing concrete. But they're persistent." "What do you recommend?" "A formal hearing," the lawyer said. "Sooner rather than later. Let a judge hear everything." Daniel exhaled. "Then let's do it." That afternoon, Annie came home from her orientation visit at the new school, unusually quiet. She placed her backpack carefully by the door and stood still, as if unsure what to do next. "How was it?" Daniel asked gently. She shrugged. "Okay, that usually means something else," he said. She looked up at him. "They asked me a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" "About where I lived before. About you. About my mommy." Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "Did that upset you?" "A little," she admitted. "But I answered. You didn't have to," he said quickly. "I wanted to," Annie replied. "I don't want people to think I'm hiding." Daniel crouched in front of her. "You don't owe anyone your story. You get to choose who hears it." She thought about that. "Can I choose you?" He smiled. "Always." That night, Annie asked to sleep with her door open. Daniel left the hallway light on. just as she preferred. He checked on her twice before going to bed himself. Sleep didn't come easily. Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words from the letter, from the phone calls, from the quiet warnings people kept offering him as if they were favors. Resolve this quietly. Protect the image. Minimize the damage. Damage. As if Annie were something that needed minimizing. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Daniel didn't tell Annie right away. He wanted her days to stay ordinary for as long as possible. Pancakes in the morning, short walks in the evening, stories before bed. But children sensed shifts before adults named them. "You're doing the thinking face again," Annie said one evening as they washed dishes together. He smiled faintly. "You're very observant. Are you worried?" He dried his hands and turned to her. "I'm preparing." "For what?" "For making sure we stay together." She froze. "Are we not going to?" Daniel knelt beside her. "We are," he said firmly. "I just have to explain some things to some people." She studied his face carefully. "Will I have to talk again?" "Only if you want to," he said. "And I'll be right there." She nodded slowly. "Okay." The night before the hearing, Daniel found Annie sitting on her bed, holding one of her drawings. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course." She held up the drawing. It showed a small girl standing under a large moon. Beside her was a taller figure, their outlines touching. "This is how I feel," Annie said. "When you're near." Daniel swallowed hard. "How's that?" "Like I'm not lost anymore." He sat beside her, careful not to overwhelm her, and rested his hand on the bed between them. "You were never lost," he said softly. "You were just waiting for someone to find you." She nodded. "I'm glad it was you." The courthouse the next day was larger than the one where temporary custody had been granted. More people, more eyes. Daniel felt the weight of attention immediately. Annie held his hand tightly. Inside the courtroom, Daniel's family sat several rows back. His mother did not look at him. The judge listened carefully as arguments were presented. Suitability, timing, public interest. Daniel's attorney countered with facts, with records, with testimony from social workers and teachers. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood slowly. "I didn't choose the circumstances that separated me from my daughter," he said, "but I choose what happens now. I choose to be present. I choose responsibility over comfort. And I choose her. Every day. Without condition." The courtroom was quiet. The judge nodded once. Annie was not asked to speak. Daniel was grateful for that. When the hearing adjourned, the decision was deferred. More time was needed, the judge said. More review. Outside, Annie looked up at Daniel, her eyes searching his face. "We didn't lose, did we?" she asked. "No," Daniel said. "We didn't." She nodded, trusting him. That evening, back home, Annie went straight to her room and closed the door softly. Daniel gave her space, then checked on her later. She was asleep, the drawing tucked under her pillow. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed and allowed himself, for the first time, to feel afraid. Not of losing status, not of losing approval, but of losing the quiet certainty Annie had begun to build. He made himself a promise in the dim light. No matter what came next, she would never face it alone again. The waiting stretched on longer than Daniel had expected. Days passed without a ruling, each one unfolding with the same careful routine he and Annie had built together. Mornings began with breakfast at the kitchen table. Annie insisted on pouring her own cereal, even when it spilled. Daniel insisted on cleaning it up without comment. Afternoons were for school orientation, paperwork, and short walks around the neighborhood. Evenings ended with stories, sometimes from books, sometimes from Daniel's own uncertain imagination. Outwardly, things looked calm. Inside, Daniel felt the tension tightening. Every phone call made his pulse spike. Every unknown number felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. He shielded Annie from most of it. But children had a way of sensing storms even when the windows were closed. On Friday evening, Annie sat unusually close to him on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, her shoulder pressed against his arm. "You're quiet," she said. "So are you," Daniel replied gently. She nodded. "I don't like quiet when people are thinking." Daniel smiled faintly. "What about when we're just sitting?" "That's different," she said. "This quiet feels heavy." He considered that. then decided honesty was better than false reassurance. Some grown-ups are deciding something important, he said. It takes time. About us? Yes. She leaned her head against his shoulder. If they say no, she asked softly, will you still visit me? Daniel's heart tightened. They won't say no. She pulled back slightly and looked at him. But if they do, he met her gaze. Then I'll keep fighting, and I'll keep coming back, no matter what. She studied his face carefully, as if measuring the weight of his words. Then she nodded, once, satisfied for now. That night, Daniel received an email from his lawyer, requesting an urgent meeting the next morning. The subject line was brief. New development. Daniel barely slept. The meeting took place in a small conference room, the blinds drawn halfway. His lawyer sat across from him, files spread neatly on the table. The judge has received additional statements, the lawyer said. From your family. Daniel's jaw tightened. What kind of statements? Concerns about long-term stability? About emotional disruption? About cultural confusion? Daniel let out a short, humorless breath. They're questioning whether she belongs with me. Yes, the lawyer said carefully, indirectly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. And the judge? He's listening, but he's also asked for something else. Daniel leaned forward. What? A home visit. Another one. Unannounced. Daniel nodded immediately. Anytime. Oak. When he returned home, Annie was at the dining table, working on a puzzle. She looked up as he entered. You're back early, she said. Yes, Daniel replied. Can we talk for a minute? She straightened, attentive. Okay. They sat across from each other. Daniel kept his tone calm, even. Someone may come to visit the house again, he said. To see how we're doing. Annie frowned slightly. Did we do something wrong? No, he said quickly. They just want to be sure. We're ready on 7th. She looked around the room, then back at him. Should I clean? Daniel smiled despite himself. No, just be yourself. She thought about that. That's harder. I know, he said. The visit came 2 days later. Karen Mitchell arrived with another official Daniel hadn't met before. A man in his 50s with a reserved expression. Annie sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, watching carefully. They observed everything. How Daniel spoke to Annie. How Annie responded. The way Daniel waited for her answers instead of filling the silence. At one point, Annie got up to get a glass of water. She spilled some on the floor and froze, her body tensing instinctively. It's okay, Daniel said immediately, standing. We'll clean it together. Annie looked at him, then slowly relaxed. Karen made a note. After the officials left, Annie sank onto the couch. I didn't like that, she said quietly. I know, Daniel replied, sitting beside her. You did great. She looked up at him. Did they see enough? Yes, he said firmly. They saw the truth. That evening, Daniel received another call from his mother. I'm disappointed, she said, without greeting. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I'm done discussing this. You're throwing away everything you were raised for, she said. No, Daniel replied. I'm finally using it for something that matters. There was a pause. If you proceed, she said coldly, you will do so without this family. Okay. Daniel's voice didn't waver. Then that's your choice. He ended the call. Annie watched him from the hallway. Was that someone mad? She asked. Yes, Daniel said honestly. Are you mad back? No, he replied. I'm clear. She nodded, absorbing that word. Clear is good. The ruling came the following week. Daniel was at work when his lawyer called. He didn't sit down. He stood by the window, heart pounding, listening. The judge has ruled, the lawyer said. Temporary custody will continue, expanded, with a path toward permanence. Daniel closed his eyes. They acknowledged the family interference. The lawyer continued. And your consistency. This isn't over, but it's moving in your favor. Daniel exhaled, long and slow. Thank you. When he got home, Annie was in her room, coloring. She looked up as he entered. You look different, she said. I have good news, he replied. Her pencil paused. Good how? They're letting us stay together, he said. And they want to help make it permanent. For a moment, Annie didn't react. Then she stood up slowly and walked toward him. Really? She asked. Yes. She stepped into his arms without asking this time, wrapping her arms around his waist. Daniel held her carefully, firmly, grounding himself in the reality of her presence. She pulled back slightly. So, I'm not going back? No, he said. You're home. Ida's no. She nodded, tears finally slipping free. Okay. That night, Annie fell asleep quickly, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Daniel sat beside her bed long after, listening to her breathe, the house quiet around them. The fight wasn't over. He knew that, but for the first time, the future didn't feel like something he had to chase. It felt like something he was allowed to protect. The first day of school arrived quietly. No reporters, no cameras, no dramatic send-off. Just a small backpack resting by the door and Annie sitting at the kitchen table, her feet swinging slowly as she stared at her bowl of oatmeal. You don't have to eat it all, Daniel said gently. I know, Annie replied. But if I don't, my stomach might growl. Daniel smiled. That would be survivable. She looked up at him. Serious. Not in a quiet classroom. He nodded, conceding the point. She finished the last spoonful with determination, then slid off the chair and picked up her backpack. The straps were still stiff, new. She adjusted them twice, then looked at Daniel. You're coming with me, right? Yes, he said. All the way to the door. That's good, she replied, just in case. The drive was short. Annie watched the school grow closer through the window, her reflection faintly overlapping the building. Daniel parked and turned off the engine. You ready? He asked. She hesitated. I think so. They walked hand in hand across the sidewalk. Daniel could feel the slight tension in her grip, the way her fingers tightened as voices and footsteps grew louder. Inside, the hallway buzzed with energy. Children laughing, parents crouching to give last-minute instructions, teachers calling names. Annie slowed. Daniel knelt beside her. You don't have to be brave, he said softly. You just have to be you. Oh, she nodded, breathing carefully. The teacher greeted them warmly, speaking directly to Annie. We're very happy you're here. Annie nodded back. Me too. She let go of Daniel's hand on her own. Not abruptly, not fearfully, just deliberately. I'll see you later, she said. I'll be right here, he replied. Same time. She nodded once and followed the teacher into the classroom without looking back. Daniel stood in the hallway longer than necessary, watching the door close. That afternoon, Annie burst through the front door with energy he hadn't yet seen from her. I made a friend, she announced, dropping her backpack. Daniel smiled. That's great. She likes drawing, Annie continued, and she asked about my necklace, but not in a weird way. That's important, Daniel said. Annie nodded vigorously. I told her my mommy gave it to me. Daniel's smile softened. I'm glad. Later that evening, as Annie worked on homework at the table, Daniel received another call from his lawyer. They're backing off, the lawyer said. Not fully, but the tone has changed. Why? Daniel asked. Public pressure, the lawyer replied. And internal fatigue. They don't want this dragged out. Daniel looked at Annie, hunched over her paper, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Good, Daniel said. Neither do I. The next few weeks passed with careful steadiness. Annie adjusted to school. She learned the rules. She learned which questions to ask and which ones to keep for later. Daniel adjusted too, learning to pack lunches, to listen to long explanations about classroom seating arrangements, to read the difference between tired silence and worried silence. One evening, Annie came home unusually quiet. Everything okay? Daniel asked. She nodded. I think so. That usually means something else, he said gently. She sighed. A kid said I was lucky. Daniel waited. They said I was lucky because I got adopted by someone rich. Daniel's chest tightened. How did that make you feel? I didn't like it, Annie said. Because you didn't pick me because of that. No, Daniel agreed. I didn't. I told them you're my dad, she continued. Not a prize. Daniel reached across the table and rested his hand near hers. That was very brave. She shrugged. It felt true. Ever. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office, reviewing documents he hadn't touched in weeks. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. No words, just a request to meet. Daniel stared at it for a long time. Then he typed back, "Tomorrow. My house." The meeting was tense but quiet. His mother sat stiffly in the living room, hands folded, eyes taking in the space. The modest furniture, the child's drawings taped to the wall, the shoes by the door. "She seems settled," she said finally. "She is," Daniel replied. "This will follow you," she said. "Everywhere." Daniel met her gaze. "So will I." She looked away. "You've changed." "Yes," he said. "For the better." She stood after a moment. "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," Daniel replied. After she left, Annie came out of her room. "Was that your mom?" she asked. "Yes." "Is she nice?" Daniel considered the question. "She's complicated." Annie nodded. "A lot of grown-ups are." "I do minded." That night, as Daniel tucked Annie in, she asked, "Do you ever wish things were different?" He paused. "I wish I'd found you sooner." She thought about that. "I'm glad you found me when you did." He smiled softly. "Me too." She turned onto her side. "If you hadn't, I think I would have been okay. But now that you did, I don't want to imagine that." Daniel sat beside her bed until she fell asleep. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by loss, but by continuity, by showing up, by staying outside. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. Inside, something fragile but strong continued to grow, not because it was protected from the world, but because it was finally rooted. The foundation paperwork arrived in a thick envelope Daniel hadn't expected to feel nervous opening. He sat at the kitchen table early Saturday morning, coffee growing cold beside him, flipping through the documents with careful attention. The words were formal petitions, recommendations, next steps, but beneath the legal language was a simple truth. The path toward permanent custody was no longer theoretical, it was becoming real. Upstairs, Annie was still asleep. Daniel paused more than once, listening for movement, as if the house itself might object to being changed so permanently. It didn't. It held its quiet, steady, as it had since Annie arrived. When she came down an hour later, her hair was still slightly tangled, her pajama sleeves too long. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs when she saw him surrounded by papers. "Are those important?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said, "but not the kind that can't wait." "Wise." She padded over and climbed into the chair across from him, peering at the pages upside down. "Do they have my name on them?" Daniel smiled. "They do." She nodded, satisfied. "Okay." They ate breakfast together slowly. Annie asked about a math assignment she hadn't understood. Daniel tried to explain it, failed, then laughed at himself. "We'll figure it out together," he said. She grinned. "My mommy used to say that too." End quote. The words still made his chest tighten, but the pain no longer felt sharp. It felt like something that could coexist with gratitude. Later that morning, Karen Mitchell returned for another scheduled visit. This time, she came alone. Annie greeted her politely, then disappeared into her room to draw, leaving Daniel and Karen at the dining table. "You've done well," Karen said after reviewing her notes. "Both of you." Daniel nodded. "We're trying." Karen looked at him steadily. "The court is leaning toward permanence." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "There is one thing you should be prepared for," Karen continued. "As this becomes official, there may be public attention again. Questions about race, privilege, power." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'll handle it." Karen's gaze softened slightly. "That's not always the same as shielding her." Daniel nodded. "I know. I'm learning when to step in and when to stand beside her." Karen closed her notebook. "That's exactly the right answer." Before she left, Karen asked if she could speak with Annie briefly. Annie agreed, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her drawing pad balanced on her knees. How do you feel about living here? Karen asked. Annie didn't answer right away. She added another line to her drawing, then looked up. It feels like my feet are on the ground, she said. Karen smiled gently. That's a good feeling. When Karen left, Annie brought Daniel her drawing. It showed a house with deep roots extending into the ground beneath it. I learned about roots at school, Annie explained. They keep things from falling over. Daniel studied the picture. You're right. That afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected visitor, Grace's sister. The call had come without warning. Daniel had frozen when he heard the name, a part of him unsure whether to answer at all. But something told him this mattered. She stood on the porch now, her posture straight, her expression guarded but not hostile. You look like her, she said after Daniel opened the door. He nodded. Thank you for coming. Inside, they sat across from each other while Annie played quietly in the next room, unaware of the weight of the moment. I didn't know where Annie was until recently, Grace's sister said. When I found out, I needed to see her with my own eyes. Daniel swallowed. You're welcome to. She nodded. I won't interfere. I just needed to know. Annie peeked around the corner, curious. Daniel gestured gently. This is someone who knew your mommy. Annie stepped forward slowly. Really? Grace's sister smiled, her eyes shining. She talked about you all the time. Annie hesitated, then reached up to touch her necklace. She gave me this. I know, the woman said softly. She told me the visit was brief, respectful. When Grace's sister left, she turned to Daniel at the door. She would be grateful, she said, that you stayed. After she was gone, Daniel sat heavily on the couch. Annie climbed up beside him without asking. You're sad, she said. A little, he admitted. But it's the kind of sad that means something mattered. She leaned against him. I think that's okay. That evening, Daniel received the official notice. A date had been set for the final custody hearing. He didn't tell Annie right away. He waited until after dinner, after homework, after the small rituals that made the house feel steady. There's going to be one more meeting, he said gently, with a judge. Annie nodded slowly. Will it be the last one? Yes, Daniel said. If everything goes the way it should, she thought about that. Can I wear my blue sweater? He smiled. Of course. That night, Daniel sat alone long after Annie fell asleep, the paperwork spread out before him. He thought about Grace, about the years that had been taken, about the quiet courage it had taken for Annie to trust him at all. Justice, he realized, was rarely loud. It didn't arrive with speeches or apologies. It arrived with consistency, with presence, with a man sitting at a kitchen table, planning a future that no longer belonged only to him. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully, the roots of her drawing becoming real beneath her. And for the first time, Daniel felt something close to peace, not because the fight was over, but because he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The courthouse was quieter than Daniel remembered. Not smaller, just quieter in the way places become when decisions are final rather than tentative. The hallways were lined with muted colors, the air cool and still. Annie walked beside him, her hand firmly in his, her blue sweater neat, her necklace resting where it always did. She looked up at him as they waited outside the courtroom. You're doing the thinking face again, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. Am I? Yes, she replied, but not the scared one. He considered that. You're right. Karen Mitchell joined them a moment later, offering Annie a reassuring nod. Good morning, she said. Are you ready? Annie thought for a moment. I think so, she said. But if I get nervous, can I hold his hand? Karen smiled. Of course. When they were called in, Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, but this time, it was steadier. Not fear. Readiness. The judge sat behind the bench, papers already arranged. He looked older than Daniel remembered, or perhaps simply more serious. Good morning, the judge said. We're here to consider a petition for permanent custody. Daniel stood when addressed, his voice calm, grounded. He answered questions about his work, his schedule, his home. He spoke about Annie without embellishment, her strengths, her fears, the ways she was still learning to trust the world. She has been asked to adapt more times than any child should, Daniel said. My role is not to change who she is, but to give her the stability to become who she's meant to be. The judge nodded, making a note. Karen testified next. Her voice was professional but firm. The child shows consistent emotional improvement, she said. She demonstrates security, attachment, and a clear sense of belonging. The judge turned to Annie. She sat very still, her feet barely touching the floor. Annie, the judge said gently, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Annie looked at Daniel, then back at the judge. I want to, she said quietly. Daniel's hand tightened around hers. The judge leaned forward slightly. Go ahead. Annie took a breath. I used to think grown-ups left because I did something wrong, she said. Her voice wavered, then steadied. But Daniel stays, even when I'm quiet, even when I'm scared. She paused, gathering courage. I don't need him to be perfect. I just need him to come back. The courtroom was very still. The judge looked at Daniel, then at Annie again. And do you feel safe with him? Yes, Annie said, without hesitation. I feel like I'm home. The judge sat back in his chair. I've reviewed the records, he said slowly. The testimony, the evaluations, and I've listened carefully today. Daniel's breath caught. I find that permanent custody is in the best interest of the child, the judge continued. Effective immediately. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. The words seemed unreal, too simple to carry the weight of what they meant. Then, Annie squeezed his hand hard. We did it, she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Daniel knelt and pulled her gently into his arms. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. He simply held her, feeling the finality of the moment settle into his bones. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled. Annie looked up at the building, then back at Daniel. So, this is forever? Daniel nodded, his voice thick. Yes. This is forever. She considered that, then smiled, not wide or dramatic, but sure. Okay. They went home slowly, neither of them in a hurry. When they reached the house, Annie dropped her backpack by the door and stood still, as if testing the truth of the moment. You're really my dad, she said. Yes, Daniel replied. And you're really my daughter. She walked into his arms and hugged him tightly. This time, there was no hesitation. That evening, they celebrated quietly. Take-out pizza on the living room floor, paper plates. Annie insisted on choosing the movie. This one, she said, pointing. It's about someone who finds where they belong. Daniel smiled. Sounds perfect. Well, later, as Daniel tucked Annie into bed, she asked, Can I keep my drawing under my pillow? Yes, he said. All of them, if you want. She nodded, then hesitated. Do you think my mommy knows? Daniel sat beside her. I think she always hoped for this. Annie closed her eyes. I think so too. After she fell asleep, Daniel sat alone in the living room, the house quiet around him. He thought about the years that had been stolen, about the lies that had shaped his life, about the choice he had finally made to stop living within someone else's version of success. Justice, he realized, hadn't arrived with punishment or apology. It had arrived with permission. Permission to stay, to love, to build something honest. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully, her breathing slow and steady, the crescent mark on her cheek catching the soft glow of the nightlight. Daniel looked up toward the stairs and made a silent vow. Forever wasn't a word. It was a practice. Life did not transform overnight. The morning after the ruling, the sun rose the same way it always had, slipping through the kitchen window and landing softly on the table. Annie padded downstairs in her socks, rubbing one eye, her hair flattened on one side. Is it still true? She asked, not quite awake yet. Daniel looked up from the coffee he hadn't finished. Yes, he said gently. It's still true. She nodded, as if confirming gravity still worked, and climbed into her chair. Only then did she smile. School resumed with its usual routines, but something subtle had shifted. Annie walked through the doors with her shoulders a little straighter. She still looked back to find Daniel before entering the classroom. but now it was habit rather than fear. Daniel noticed it all. He noticed how she talked more at dinner, how she sang quietly while doing homework, how she no longer flinched when doors closed too loudly. These weren't dramatic changes. They were small corrections, like a compass slowly realigning. One evening, Annie came home carrying a folded piece of paper. "My teacher asked us to write about our family," she said, placing it carefully on the table. Daniel waited. "And how did that go?" She shrugged. "I didn't know how to start." "Did you figure it out?" She nodded and unfolded the paper. "I used to live in many places. Now I live with my dad. He listens to me. We make pancakes. We read stories. I feel safe." Daniel didn't speak right away. He reached across the table and rested his hand near hers. "That's a very good start," he said quietly. A few days later, the press found him anyway. It wasn't dramatic, just a reporter waiting near the office, asking polite questions with sharp edges hidden beneath them. Daniel answered only once. "This is a private matter involving a child," he said. "There will be no further comment." He meant it. At home, Annie sensed something was different. "Did someone ask you about me?" she asked that night. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "Did you tell them?" "No," he replied. "Some things aren't for strangers." She considered that. "I like that." The following weekend, Daniel took Annie to visit Grace's grave. He hadn't planned to. The idea had hovered between them unspoken, waiting until neither of them felt rushed or forced. Annie wore a simple jacket, her necklace resting against her collarbone. The cemetery was quiet, the air cool. Annie stood still in front of the headstone, reading the name slowly. "Hi, Mommy," she said softly. Daniel stepped back, giving her space, his own chest tight. "I found him," Annie continued. He didn't know, but he stayed. She touched the necklace, then placed a small drawing at the base of the stone. It showed a house, a tree, and a moon overhead. Daniel felt tears sting his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. On the way home, Annie was quiet. "Do you feel sad?" Daniel asked gently. "A little," she said. "But also finished." He nodded. "That makes sense." That night, Annie asked a question Daniel had been expecting. "Will I have to change my last name?" she asked. Daniel paused. "Only if you want to." She thought about it for a long moment. "I want to keep Mommy with me," she said. "But I want yours too." Daniel smiled softly. "Then we'll do that." The paperwork took time. Everything did. But the urgency was gone now, replaced by intention. They filled out forms together, Annie carefully copying her name, tongue peeking out in concentration. One afternoon, Daniel's phone rang while Annie was coloring. He glanced at the screen. His mother. He hesitated, then answered. "I heard the ruling," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. There was a pause. "I wanted to see her." Daniel looked at Annie, sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming quietly. "That's not my decision alone," he said. "I understand," his mother replied. "I won't push." Daniel didn't promise anything. But when he hung up, he didn't feel anger, only clarity. Later that evening, Annie asked, "Is your mom still mad?" "She's learning," Daniel said. Annie nodded. "Learning takes time." "Yes," he agreed. As weeks passed, the house filled with signs of permanence. A calendar on the fridge. Shoes by the door that stayed there. Drawings taped and retaped as Annie refined them. One night, as Daniel tucked Annie in, she asked, "Do you ever miss being alone?" He considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "but not in the way you might think." "How do you mean?" "I miss the quiet," he said, "but I don't miss the emptiness." She smiled sleepily. "Me neither." After she fell asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table. The house settled around him. He thought about the life he had once believed was complete, the version of success he had chased without questioning who it served. Annie had not fixed him. She had revealed him. Outside, the streetlight flickered on, casting a warm glow through the window. Inside, a future unfolded, slowly, deliberately, built not on grand gestures, but on mornings, questions, and the promise of staying. The first holiday arrived without ceremony. Daniel hadn't planned anything elaborate. No trips, No photographers, no announcements, just a quiet Sunday and a kitchen that smelled faintly of cinnamon because Annie had insisted on helping bake something she'd seen in a book. "It's called coffee cake," she explained, reading carefully. "But I can't drink coffee." "That's fine," Daniel said. "I probably shouldn't either." Deasing mind, final acid. They worked side by side, Annie measuring with exaggerated precision. Daniel pretending not to notice when she added a little too much sugar. When the cake went into the oven, Annie sat at the table, swinging her legs. "Is this what holidays are?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "Just being here," she said. Together, Daniel considered it. "I think that's the best kind." Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Annie froze, not dramatically, just enough for Daniel to notice the way her shoulders tightened, the way her eyes flicked toward him before the door. "I've got it," Daniel said calmly. He opened the door to find his mother standing on the porch, hands folded around a small paper bag. She looked older than he remembered, or perhaps simply less certain. "I brought something," she said. Daniel didn't move aside immediately. "Annie's inside." "I know," she replied. "I won't stay long. Away." After a pause, Daniel stepped aside. Annie watched from the hallway, her fingers curled into the hem of her sweater. Daniel didn't call her forward. He let her choose. His mother looked around the house slowly. The drawings, the shoes, the faint smell of baking. "She's really here," she said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "She is." Annie took a small step forward. "This is Annie," Daniel said gently. "Annie, this is my mother." Annie looked up, then nodded politely. "Hello." "I go." His mother crouched slightly, not quite kneeling. "Hello, Annie." There was a pause, fragile and unsteady. "I brought muffins," his mother said, holding out the bag. "I didn't know what you liked." Annie glanced at Daniel. "Do you like muffins?" he asked. "Yes," Annie said cautiously. She accepted the bag, her fingers brushing against the paper. "Thank you." Something shifted in his mother's expression, surprise, perhaps, or relief. "I won't stay," she said. "I just wanted to see." Daniel nodded. "That's enough for today." When the door closed behind her, Annie stood still for a moment. "She didn't yell," she said. "No," Daniel replied. "She looked scared." Daniel thought about that. Sometimes people are scared of losing control. Annie nodded slowly. "I don't like that feeling." "Neither do I." That evening, Annie asked to light a candle for her mommy. Daniel set it on the kitchen counter, watching as Annie carefully struck the match with supervision he didn't announce. "Hi, Mommy," Annie whispered. "We made cake, and I'm okay." Daniel stood nearby, silent, present. In the weeks that followed, Annie's world continued to expand in small, deliberate ways. She joined an after-school art club. She invited her first friend over, nervously explaining the rules of her room as if it were sacred ground. Daniel listened from the kitchen as laughter floated down the hall, unfamiliar and wonderful. One evening, Annie came home upset. "Someone said I'm lucky again," she said, dropping her backpack. Daniel looked up from the stove. "What did they say this time?" "They said not everyone gets a dad who fights for them." Daniel turned off the heat and sat down across from her. "How did that make you feel?" She frowned. Confused. "Why?" "Because I didn't do anything special," Annie said. "I just waited." Daniel reached across the table. "Sometimes the bravest thing a person does is survive long enough to be found." She thought about that. "I was brave?" "Yes," he said. "Very." That night, Daniel received an email from the board of his company. A proposal, a request, a polite reminder that public perception still mattered. He closed the laptop without replying. Later, as he tucked Annie in, she asked, "Do you still go to work?" "Yes," Daniel said, "but not the same way." How?" "I don't stay when I don't need to," he replied, "and I come home when I should." She smiled. "That's good." One Saturday morning, Annie asked a question that caught him off guard. "Can I call you Dad?" she asked. Daniel froze, then forced himself to breathe. "You can call me whatever feels right." She nodded, processing. "Okay." The next morning, as he poured coffee, she appeared in the doorway. "Dad?" she said, tentative. Daniel turned, heart pounding. Yes. She smiled, small but sure. Nothing. I just wanted to see if it worked. He laughed quietly, tears stinging his eyes. It works. That evening, Daniel found Annie at her desk, writing carefully. What are you doing? He asked. I'm making a list, she said. Things I know now. Like what? She read aloud. That leaving isn't always forever. That grown-ups can change. That homes aren't buildings. Daniel listened, silent. She added one more line. That love doesn't hurry. When she finished, she looked up at him. Is that true? Daniel nodded. It is, as the house settled into sleep that night. Daniel stood by Annie's door longer than usual. He thought about the man he had been busy, protected, distant. He thought about the quiet courage of a child who had taught him how to stay. Justice, he realized, had not arrived with punishment. It had arrived with repair. And repair, unlike revenge, required patience. It required showing up again the next day. And the day after that, the letter arrived on thick cream-colored paper, addressed in Annie's careful handwriting. Daniel found it waiting on the kitchen table when he came home from work, propped upright against a glass of pencils. Annie sat nearby, legs tucked under her chair, watching him with an expression that was half proud, half anxious. You have to read it out loud, she said quickly. That's the rule. Daniel smiled and picked it up. What rule? The rule I just made, Annie replied. He unfolded the paper slowly, recognizing the effort in every letter. Dear Dad, my teacher says we have to write about someone who changed our life. I picked you. You didn't know me at first, but you stayed anyway. You taught me that quiet doesn't mean alone. I like when you wait for me to talk. Love, Annie. Daniel didn't speak when he finished. He set the paper down carefully, as if it were something fragile. Annie shifted in her seat. Is it okay? It's more than okay, Daniel said, his voice low. It's everything. She let out a breath she'd been holding and smiled. That night, Daniel placed the letter in the top drawer of his desk, not with contracts or documents, but alone, where it wouldn't be buried. Some things, he understood now, were not meant to be filed away. As weeks turned into months, the extraordinary slowly became ordinary. Annie lost her first tooth at school and insisted on calling Daniel immediately, her voice breathless with excitement. He left a meeting early without explanation and arrived just in time to see her grin, gap-toothed and triumphant. Does the tooth fairy know where we live? She asked that night. Daniel laughed. I think she's very good at finding places where kids feel safe. Annie nodded, satisfied. They planted the tree she had talked about months earlier, digging the hole together in the backyard. Annie insisted on packing the soil herself, patting it down with solemn care. So it won't fall over, she said. So it won't fall over, Daniel echoed. At school, Annie began raising her hand more often. Her teacher mentioned it casually during a conference. She's finding her voice, she said. Daniel smiled. She always had one. She just needed to know it mattered. 8. Not everything was easy. There were days Annie came home withdrawn. Days when something small, a raised voice, a slammed door sent her retreating inward. Daniel learned not to rush those moments. He learned to sit nearby, present without pressure. One evening, Annie asked, Do you ever get scared I'll disappear? Daniel answered honestly. Sometimes. She looked up. What do you do when you feel that way? I stay, he said. And I remind myself why. She nodded slowly. That helps. Their questions, the world outside their home continued to move, continued to watch. Invitations arrived, galas, interviews, speaking engagements framed as opportunities. Daniel declined most of them. The ones he accepted, he did quietly, without spectacle. When asked why, he answered simply, My priorities have changed. Some people understood, others didn't. Daniel stopped caring which was which. One afternoon, Annie came home with a permission slip for a field trip. You have to sign it, she said, sliding it across the table. And it says parents can come. Daniel looked at the paper. Would you like me to? She nodded quickly, then hesitated. Only if you want to. I want to, he said without hesitation. The trip was loud and chaotic, and nothing like Daniel's usual environment. Annie stayed close at first, then gradually wandered farther, checking back with quick glances. "You're still there," she said once, smiling. "I will be," he replied. That night, after Annie fell asleep, Daniel sat on the edge of her bed longer than usual. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt held. He thought about the past, the lies that had shaped it, the silence that had stolen time. He thought about the future, uncertain and demanding, and real. Justice, he realized, wasn't about correcting the past. It was about refusing to repeat it. The next morning, Annie asked, "Do you think other kids like me find their dads?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Some do," he said. "Some find other people who love them just as much." She thought about that. "I hope they do." "So do I," he replied. Later that week, Daniel received a call from his lawyer. "All paperwork is complete," the lawyer said. "There's nothing left pending." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Thank you." When he told Annie, she didn't react right away. "So no more judges?" she asked. "No more judges. No more visits?" "No more visits." She nodded, absorbing it. Then she smiled, wide and unguarded. "Then can we just live now?" Daniel laughed softly. "Yes, we can just live." That evening, they sat on the back porch together, watching the sun dip behind the houses. Annie leaned against his side, her head resting easily against his arm. "Dad?" she said. "Yes, I think my mommy would like you." Daniel swallowed. "I hope so." Reked. "I think she does," Annie said. "Because you didn't leave." Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close, feeling the quiet certainty of the moment. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded. Life continued, imperfect and relentless. But here, in this small space, something had been restored. Not perfectly, but permanently. The graduation ceremony took place on a bright spring morning, the kind that made the air feel newly washed. Daniel sat in the folding chair reserved for parents, his jacket draped over the back, the program folded neatly in his hands. Around him, families murmured softly, adjusting cameras, whispering reminders. He watched Annie line up with her classmates near the stage, her posture straight, her blue dress simple and neat. She caught his eye and smiled, not the cautious smile she once practiced. This one was open, certain. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not anxiety this time, but awe. When Annie's name was called, she walked across the stage with careful confidence. She accepted her certificate with both hands and turned to face the audience. Her eyes searched, found him instantly, and she lifted her chin just a little, as if to say, "I'm okay." Daniel stood and applauded, not caring that his clapping was louder than necessary. Afterward, families spilled out onto the lawn. Annie ran toward him, breathless. "Did you see?" she asked. "I saw everything," Daniel replied. She beamed. "I didn't trip." "That was your biggest concern?" he asked, smiling. "Yes," she said seriously. "I practiced." They took pictures together, nothing staged, nothing formal. Just Annie leaning against him, the sun catching the crescent mark on her cheek. On the drive home, Annie was unusually quiet. "Tired?" Daniel asked. "A little," she said. Then, after a pause, thinking, "About what?" She traced the edge of her certificate with her finger. "About before." Daniel waited. "I used to think I was invisible," she said softly. "Like if I disappeared, no one would notice." Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You were never invisible." "I know that now," Annie replied. "But I didn't then." They drove in silence for a moment. "Do you know what changed?" she asked. Daniel glanced at her. "What?" "You looked at me like I mattered," she said simply. "Not like a problem. Not like a mistake." Daniel swallowed hard. "You do matter." She nodded, as if that were settled. That evening, Daniel found Annie in her room, sorting through a box of old drawings. Some were crumpled, others carefully folded. She held one up. "This was from the care center," she said. "I drew houses a lot." Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "You were imagining." "I was practicing," she corrected gently. She placed the drawing back in the box, then closed it. "I think I'm done with these," she said. Daniel nodded. "We can keep them, if you want." I know, Annie replied, but I don't need them anymore. Later that night, Daniel received an unexpected call from his mother. I saw the photos, she said. From the school. Daniel didn't respond immediately. She looks happy. His mother continued. She is, Daniel said. There was a pause. I want to apologize. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. For what? For believing I knew better, she said. For deciding without asking. Daniel exhaled slowly. That hurt a lot of people. I know, she replied, including you. Another pause. May I visit? She asked. If Annie agrees? Daniel looked down the hallway toward Annie's room. I'll ask her. When he did, Annie listened quietly. Do you want to? Daniel asked. Annie thought for a long moment. I can try, she said. But not for long. That's fair, Daniel replied. The visit was awkward but respectful. His mother brought no gifts, made no demands. She listened more than she spoke. When Annie showed her a drawing, she knelt to look at it properly. It's beautiful, she said. Annie nodded. Thank you. Afterward, Annie retreated to her room. Daniel checked on her later. You okay? He asked. She nodded. It was strange. Yes, he agreed. But I liked that she didn't pretend, Annie added. She just stayed. Daniel smiled faintly. That matters. Summer arrived quietly. They took small trips, day drives, picnics by the lake. Annie learned to ride a bike without training wheels, wobbling and laughing as Daniel jogged beside her. Don't let go, she called. I won't, he said. She pedaled a little farther. Okay, she said, breathless. You can now. Daniel let go, watching as she rode on, steady and free. When she stopped and looked back, her grin was radiant. I did it, she shouted. Yes, Daniel replied. That night, Annie sat on the back porch, legs dangling, watching the fireflies appear one by one. Do you think stories end? She asked suddenly. Daniel considered the question. Some do, he said. But the good ones usually just change chapters. She nodded thoughtfully. I like this chapter. So do I. She leaned her head against his shoulder. What's the next one about? Daniel wrapped an arm around her. About growing, he said. About choosing. About staying. She smiled. I'm good at staying now. Daniel closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of summer, feeling the weight of years settle into something lighter. The past had not been erased, but it no longer defined the horizon. The anniversary arrived without warning. Daniel noticed it first on the calendar, circled lightly in pencil. 5 years since the day he had walked into the care center. 5 years since a little girl with a crescent-shaped mark on her cheek had looked up at him, wary and polite, holding a gift box too tightly. He didn't mention it right away. Life had taught him that the most important moments didn't need announcing. Annie noticed anyway. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen that morning, backpack on, shoes already tied, studying him with the same careful attention she had once used to decide whether adults were safe. You're smiling, she said. But it's the quiet kind. Daniel looked up. Am I? Yes, Annie replied. Like when you remember something important, he nodded. You're very perceptive. She considered that. Is today a day? Daniel paused, then smiled. Yes, it is. She stepped closer. The day we found each other? The day we began, he said. Annie nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that word. Began. School passed quickly that day. Annie came home buzzing with stories, but underneath it all, there was anticipation. She watched Daniel move around the house, waiting. That evening, he handed her a small box. It wasn't wrapped. It didn't need to be. Annie opened it carefully. Inside was a thin silver charm, shaped like a crescent moon. Her breath caught. It matches, she whispered, touching her necklace. I know, Daniel said. I thought you might like something that reminds you of where you started and where you are now. She lifted her eyes to him, shining. Can I put it on? Of course. She threaded it onto the chain herself, fingers steady. It feels complete, she said. They ate dinner on the back porch that night, the air warm. The tree they had planted years earlier now tall enough to cast real shade. Fireflies appeared as the sky darkened. blinking in and out like quiet signals. Annie leaned back in her chair. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gone there? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Sometimes, he said, but not in the way I used to. How? I don't think about what I lost, he replied. I think about what I found. She smiled. Me too. Later, Annie brought out a notebook, worn and familiar. I've been working on something, she said. Daniel recognized it immediately. Her first book, the one she had started years ago. She opened it and handed it to him. The last page had been added. Once upon a time, a girl thought she was alone, but she wasn't. She was just early, and the right person came when it mattered most. They didn't fix each other. They stayed, and that was enough. Daniel closed the notebook carefully. It's perfect, he said. She shrugged, but she was smiling. I think so too. In the years that followed, Annie grew the way children are meant to, unevenly, curiously, sometimes painfully, always forward. She asked hard questions. She made mistakes. She learned when to forgive and when to protect herself. Daniel learned too. He learned that being a father meant listening more than speaking, that justice wasn't loud, that love didn't erase scars but made room for them. The foundation they built together grew quietly. No grand speeches, no branding campaigns, just work. Annie insisted on helping, reading letters from children, suggesting ideas with the seriousness of someone who understood what waiting felt like. One evening, when Annie was nearly grown, she stood in the doorway of Daniel's study. Do you think we did okay? She asked. Daniel looked up from his papers. More than okay. She stepped inside. With everything, he considered her no longer the cautious child from the care center, but still carrying that same quiet strength. We chose each other, he said. Every day. That counts, she nodded. I want to do that too. Choose. You already do, he replied. Years later, on another quiet evening, Annie returned home after a long day, older now, steadier. She sat beside Daniel on the porch, the moon hanging low in the sky. Dad, she said. Yes? I don't think destiny is magic anymore. Daniel smiled faintly. What do you think it is? I think it's when people don't turn away, she said, even when it's hard. He nodded. I think you're right. They sat in silence, the kind that no longer needed filling. Somewhere in that quiet, the past finally loosened its grip, not because it had been forgiven all at once, but because it had been answered, day by day, with presence. The story did not end. It never would. It simply continued, rooted, steady, and alive, proving that love, when chosen again and again, was stronger than loss, louder than injustice, and patient enough to wait until the right moment to arrive. And this time, it stayed. This story reminds us that true justice and real love are not loud, dramatic, or instantaneous. They are built through presence, responsibility, and the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk away. Blood alone does not make a family choice, does? The story teaches that silence, lies, and prejudice can steal years from innocent lives, but quiet perseverance can restore what was lost. Above all, it shows that healing does not come from erasing the past, but from facing it honestly and choosing, every single day, to love, protect, and remain faithful to one another. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.